Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colin Megill. Thank you so much to the organizers for having me, and good afternoon to everyone. I am co-founder of pol.is and a board member of the Computational Democracy Project. And today I'm going to talk about the technology pol.is and Taiwan's implementation of that technology and where they are today, a couple other implementations of the technology around the world, and then a few bigger picture topics around polarization, parties, and citizen assemblies. So pol.is, briefly, if you're unfamiliar with it, is a technology for gathering people's opinions in their own words using machine learning. The idea basically is that everyone can submit a statement. The statements that are submitted by the participants go into a pool, and they're chosen one at a time and shown to everyone else, and everyone has an opportunity to agree, disagree, or pass on everything everyone else has said. This creates a matrix, which is every participant by every comment which has been submitted by every other participant, and this matrix is a graph, and this can then be analyzed by statistical algorithms. And Taiwan implemented the technology in several high-profile legislative cases in its regulation of Uber and Airbnb, online alcohol sales, revenge pornography, as well as more recently in cases like regulating waterways and natural areas. The implementation in the case of Taiwan was done early. It created a reference map of all people's who had participated opinion. It brought all stakeholders into one area where they could all express their views and interact with each other's ideas and find surprising consensus. The platform was integrated into more recently a platform called Join, which has traffic from nearly half of Taiwan's population. Taiwan is also participating in the development of the technology because the technology is open source. pol.is has been open source since 2016, and it has enjoyed improvement from Canada's government, as well as Taiwan, as well as a community of volunteers from around the world who've come and contributed code translations into different languages, and also the fundamental advancements in data analysis that have driven the platform forward as well in some cases. So, in the case of Taiwan, I'll call out one specific example other than Uber, which has been covered quite broadly, and that is online alcohol sales. In the case of online alcohol sales, the government was deadlocked for a period of roughly 6 years on the question of whether or not to allow alcohol to be sold via the internet. There were two stakeholder groups. One of the stakeholder groups was focused on promoting the existence of a national online ID. This is something that would be necessary if you wanted to purchase alcohol online. On the other hand, there was a group that was against the law, and this group was in favor of more treatment and prevention for people who were suffering from alcoholism, and their promotion of having more investment in this area would meant that each side was in effect using the law to its own advantage, to leverage the oh, and sorry, just to check, I heard a noise. Can everyone still hear me? Okay, I believe. Okay. Thanks. Apologies. Yep. In the case of online alcohol sales, both stakeholder groups were using the legal process to attempt to get their own ends met. And so in 6 years, they had never come into a common space where they had been able to interact with each other's ideas. And as it turned out, those who were in favor of an online ID were not opposed to more treatment and prevention, and vice versa. Those who wanted more treatment and prevention were not opposed to a national ID. And also, the group who wanted more treatment and prevention did not think this was going to increase access to alcohol. And so there were a number of surprising points where each side had ascribed certain views to the other side that it did not have, and bringing everyone into one common space and creating a map of opinions was illuminating. And then that map that Polis created was passed to subsequent steps in a facilitated in-person deliberative process. And so this is quite exciting. One of the reasons that Taiwan became a rather high-profile case study in digital democracy, also though, was that the activist community, as a result of protests, had won binding facilitative rulemaking with the government as a part of the concessions in the area of technology policy. And this meant that these deliberations that this map of opinion space was being inserted into became law in the case of Uber, and had quite a bit of influence and power. In the case of where there is not binding facilitating rulemaking that involves citizens, which is more the norm, Polis has been used in national scale, statistically significant, demographically representative samples to provide a different kind of way to ask the population about its views. In other words, if we ask a population, for instance, Columbia University asked thousands of people in Bowling Green, Kentucky, by way of an independent news partner, not a statistically significant sample, but wrote letters, did a recruitment strategy, and got thousands of roughly 2,000 people in a city of 20,000 people in the United States into a common space to discuss their city, even though this was what we call in the United States a purple district, where there are people from left and right. And bringing everyone into a common space yielded a number of surprising results, which were that even though people had been polarized on a number of hot button issues, there were many local issues, issues like cable rates and education, that were not at all polarized, and in fact there were surprising consensus, and there were also stakeholder groups that didn't align in the way that one might expect them to, given the way that they felt about other issues. So this has been exciting to us for a number of reasons, but one of them is that there had been, in each of these case studies that we've worked in, an opportunity to see the population in a way that it can describe itself. In the case of our case study in homelessness, in New York City Department of Homelessness, there was an opportunity to ask, how can we improve services, and to ask frontline workers and janitors and caseworkers and people who have not been asked their view, people who are not close to the trunk of the tree, right, but are out in the leaves. Perhaps it's harder for communication or for feedback to move around from them and to affect policy. And so this is something that we're very passionate about, which is enabling people's lived experiences and to instruct policy in a scalable and repeatable way, and to increase the sensory apparatus, so to speak, of deliberative mechanisms in government that aren't limited to our initial representations of how we think we understand the population at the outset. In other words, we can attempt to understand the population on its own terms, in its own words, and then take that representation, which is hopefully a better representation of the population, and insert it into policy. If we back up to consider some of the implications of the or the effects of parties as they operate today, we come to a very a troubling point with regards to understanding the population in its own words, which is that parties have a tendency to understand and identify consensus and then discard it because it's not useful for marketing. Parties need divisive issues and they need to differentiate themselves relative to others. That's what's useful. In the United States, there are many issues which are broadly consensus on issues that are thought to be divisive. Universal background checks for in the United States typically polls at over some version of the questioning in the United States will typically poll, if you just ask on that question, at over 80% consensus. And so, when we phrase issues differently, when we ask people to rephrase things, even subtly, there's a very interesting potential outcome. When I last spoke in Italy, there was a surprising example of this. It was at the time that Renzi had put forward the constitutional referendum, and I ran a very small polls conversation in a group of about 40 people in person in Italy, and the result was perhaps surprising. On one hand, there were roughly split two even groups, one in favor of changing the constitution in Italy and centralizing powers in the legislature, as I understood it at the time. Hopefully, I have that right. Centralizing powers in the executive away from the legislature, and a group opposed to that. However, at the time, Renzi had promised or threatened that he would resign if he did not, if he was unsuccessful in his bid to change the constitution. If I understand hopefully I understand the issue correctly. It's been 5 years or so. But to my memory, what happened was that these two groups were evenly polarized. However, there was a surprising consensus statement which had been submitted and had 100% agreement in the crowd. And that was that Renzi had invalidated the exercise by threatening to resign. In other words, he had turned it into an election surrogate. And as a result of that, it was not likely to be a pure test of whether or not the country was going to change the constitution. And there was another surprising statement, which was that a majority of people did believe the Constitution should be changed. And so, while this was not statistically significant, it was interesting to see these two stakeholder groups had a different, to use a word from math, topology. There's a different shape of the opinion landscape than just A versus B group or A versus B polarized issue. The issues that we consider that might just be one-dimensional, A versus B, or exist, or that all issues would be bundled as parties do along a line. Perhaps if we unbundle them, we have more opportunity to appreciate the fullness of the people's opinion, and perhaps if we have better representations of the public ahead of processes, we can work to understand the population in its own words. I'll end here, and thank you so much for having me. And thanks to the organizers, and good evening to all of you.